Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SPME webinar show. I am Zohran Mamdani, the Executive Director of SPME and the Association for Middle East Studies in Africa, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity once again to talk to our friend and colleague Alex Jaffe, the editor of our BDS Monitor, about all the latest that's going on as far as BDS and anti-Semitism around the world. Unfortunately, the news cycle keeps on providing us more to talk about, from Australia to Brown and to MIT this week alone. And obviously, the political narrative and the connections that go into the connectivity as far as the growth of anti-Semitism worldwide is clearly affecting our space all around. So there's much to discuss. This will be obviously a little bit of a teaser to the upcoming end of the year monitor, which will be coming out a little bit right before New Year's. So there'll be a much longer conversation about a lot of the topics that Alex will be discussing this afternoon in greater depth. And as all of you know, since the war has begun, there is our extensive BDS digest has grown exponentially as a result of the growing topics to discuss. This will be our last webinar for the year. So of course, be on the lookout for future webinars right after New Year's. Of course, I want to thank everybody for being with us throughout this year and encourage you to continue supporting our work throughout the next year. This is the end of the year, so I will make, kindly, your ongoing support for our work is always needed. So consider supporting us on our donation page for continuing the work that we need to be doing for the next year. And obviously, it is greatly appreciated all around. From a logistical standpoint, just to jump to the next topic, of course, Alex will talk for about a half hour or so. Then we will go into Q&A. Q&A, as always, will be done via the chat. Feel free to type in your questions via the chat, and I will do my best to get to all your questions in a timely fashion. If we don't, feel free to email us after the webinar, and we will do our best to respond as well. So really, without further ado, Alex, thank you again for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Well, terrific, and thank you to everybody for being here and for taking the time to listen to my thoughts about where we are here at the end of 2025. Where are we? As I sometimes say, this is an exercise in method. It's an exercise in philosophy. How do we understand the world and where we are? And we can look at good news, we can look at the bad news. And we should, but I think we should always be asking, what are we seeing that's a leading indicator? What are we seeing that's a trailing indicator? And keep in mind that there are trends or developments that are slow moving, but also ones that are fast moving. And all of these different data points interact with one another. And we have to kind of create a picture that is satisfying or comprehensible, at least, to understand where it is that we are at this particular moment. And summarizing the year is always a difficult exercise, regardless. So I think the place to start out of necessity, out of respect, is the bad news. And the bad news is more than a dozen Jews being gunned down at a Hanukkah celebration on a beach in Sydney, Australia, by a father-son duo pledged to the Islamic State, who had trained in the Philippines, in a part of the Philippines where Australian citizens are not allowed to go, and who came back and who possessed firearms in contravention, apparently, of Australia's incredibly strict firearms restrictions, and who killed a bunch of Jews anyway. We can add to this other things that are going on in the kinetic space, in the space of violent attacks, not simply protests, but attacks. The still extremely mysterious and concerning incident at Brown University where two students were killed, one of whom was the university's most prominent conservative activist. And lo and behold, the university doesn't seem to have had any cameras in that part of the building or in the classroom. And there are reports that suggest that those cameras had been turned off or removed at the demand of pro-Hamas protesters earlier this year who didn't want to be identified. There is the still mysterious murder of a leading nuclear scientist from MIT, gunned down in the foyer of his Brookline, Massachusetts apartment building. There are conflicting reports about whether he was actually Jewish or not, but he does seem to have been pro-Israel. And there are, again, unconfirmed reports that that intelligence sources have determined that this was retaliation for the killing of Iranian nuclear scientists before and during the 12-day war earlier this year. I have a couple of violent assaults in New York City on the subway, stabbing in Crown Heights, the invasion of a Los Angeles synagogue by pro-Hamas protesters who were agitating against a security fair that was being held at the facility for Jewish and also Korean members of the Korean community. The usual riots in London and elsewhere, the cancellation of Christmas markets in Germany and the identification of Islamic State plots in Germany aimed at Christmas markets, Christmas celebrations, the cancellation of all New Year's celebrations in Paris, and the breaking up of a plot by the Turtle Island Liberation Front, an Antifa group dedicated to anti-Israel, anti-American, and anti-capitalist agitation and the overthrow of these elements. And it was the Turtle Island Liberation Front. Turtle Island is a phrase that anarchists and other groups use to suggest that Turtle Island, North America, this is presumably or alleged to be a Native American phrase for North America, which has been adopted very much by communist and anarchist groups to indicate their rejection of the idea of the United States of America, as well as of capitalism. So I think I think the bad news about where we are at is that we are in a new kind of kinetic phase where direct action is being taken by various elements against the organized Jewish community, against individual Jews, really around the world. And I think the question that we should be keeping in mind, pursuant in particular to the most identifiable, to the two most identifiable components of this attack front, one Muslim, the other anarchist communist, is the Jewish question, which has been rephrased in the 21st century as the Israel question. Jews can only be safe if they repudiate in the 19th and 20th century their Judaism, and in the 21st century Israel and collective identification with Jews and Judaism. But the question is never the question. It's a hackneyed phrase that is thrown around in these situations, and that I think both sets of attackers, the Muslims on the one hand, the anarchist communists on the other hand, indicate that the question is really the Jews are the first targets. The Jews are the convenient targets. America is the larger target, the little Satan in Iranian Shia parlance, to the great Satan, but also that capitalism, the West, the Enlightenment are the overarching targets. And these groups are very much in ideological alliance. Various Palestinian groups, pro-Hamas groups in America have come out, for example, in protest against ICE and enforcement of laws regarding, illegal border crossing and visa overstays and so on. So there's a unified front. It's not clear how closely organized it is. We certainly saw in the aftermath of the Australia massacre that a wide variety of websites and bots produced millions and millions of tweets and other social media postings celebrating the killings, stating that Israel was the cause and that Jews around the world are unsafe because of Israel, which posits, which frankly states outright that Muslims cannot control themselves because in distant lands because of their agitation over Israel, and that Jews are unsafe wherever they are. Now that's only part of the bad news. It is my fate to collect lots of bad news like this, but there's also good news, and we have to keep this in mind. I think this is very interesting. Again, methodological, also philosophical kind of situation. So in the last week, this week, there's a Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu announced a $35 billion gas export deal with Egypt, which is a kind of add-on or extension to the Abraham Accords, which creates or expands the economic relationship between the two countries and which will reduce, increase energy flow to Egypt, and which has all sorts of local political and economic implications, and presumably, hopefully, reduce geopolitical friction between Israel and Egypt themselves. There are, I think, at least three multi-billion dollar arms deals that were announced this week. Two with Germany, one with, I think, Poland. Israeli manufacturers are doing huge business in Europe in particular, but also in Asia, capitalizing on their proven technologies at a time when Europe in particular feels itself tremendously under threat from Russian expansionism and sabotage. There are numerous industrial facilities across Europe have been sabotaged by Russian teams. Drones are flying all over the place. Every airport across Europe is being shut down periodically because of drone incursions, and so on. So they're looking for defense tech, and Israeli manufacturers are providing, much to the benefit of the Israeli economy. NVIDIA today or yesterday announced a huge expansion of its campus in Israel. They bought 25 acres near Haifa someplace, and are planning basically a community for 10,000 people, representing billions of dollars worth of investment. Excuse me. Yesterday, Israel, Cyprus, and Greece announced a unique sort of defense alliance aimed at Turkish expansionism, wherein each power is going to contribute troops and aircraft in a kind of mini Eastern European NATO, Eastern Mediterranean, I'm sorry, NATO kind of alliance. And to my knowledge, this is unique in the region. So that's only some of the good news. Now, which of these are we to give more weight to? I think one of the conclusions is that the Israeli economy is doing surprisingly well after 2 years of bitter warfare in Gaza. And the diaspora Jewish community around the world, but particularly in areas where there are very large Muslim populations, is doing very poorly. Australia, it should be noted, imported 400,000 Muslims in the last 20 to 25 years, going from a population of a few thousand to something like 400 plus thousand. Canada did the same thing. Canada overall has increased its population by 15% in the last 5 or 10 years, which is extraordinary, has extraordinary social and economic implications, and also, not surprisingly, social cohesion implications. And we see this being played out on the streets, particularly in Toronto and Montreal, where Jews are being harassed and assaulted on a regular basis. Australian Jews regarded themselves as very much exempt, one might say. Not exempt, but on the sidelines for many, many years of global anti-Semitic trends, no longer, as did Canadian Jews, and that is no longer the case. And they're both of these communities, which are not terribly large, comparatively find themselves in very similar situations to those particularly in Britain and France, which are, if not under siege, then they're under threat. And we saw this in the attack last month or at the end of October, whenever it was, against the Birmingham synagogue in Britain, which killed several members of the congregation and a policeman. We see this all over Europe. So it's one of these. I don't want to be dismissive and say, it's a good news, bad news situation. That's not rigorous in any way. But long-term trends, like in particular Muslim migration to Western countries and to the Anglosphere, as it was once called, English-speaking countries, which has been going on intensely since about 2000, has had very fast-moving implications now in these countries, and shifting the politics, but more immediately killing and harassing members of the Jewish community. So again, fast and slow trends, leading and trailing indicators. Here it's, I think, a little more difficult, at least for me, to try and figure out where it is that we're at and what the trends are. Just today, several hundred musicians and artists, mostly centered in the UK, signed a letter demanding that Live Nation, which is the world's largest entertainment production company, boycott Israel and prohibit acts from performing in Israel. And this follows on last month's, or earlier this month's, declaration from many of the same artists, hundreds of them, that they were demanding that streaming platforms like Apple Music and Spotify remove their music from access in Israel to make it inaccessible. And this is a countrywide boycott that they're demanding. and that they're demanding these major corporations facilitate and participate in for all, and their demands are couched in the usual kinds of terms. They don't want to have anything to do with this genocidal country, and of course, it makes no distinction between. Uh, it doesn't even make the distinction as sometimes people once did between the good Jews and the bad Jews. The good Jews in Israel who are against the Netanyahu government, who reject the Gaza war, et cetera, and the bad Jews who are in favor of these presumably reprehensible things. It's just Israel per se. We want it shunned. We want it out of the picture. And the situation in other art areas of the arts is the same, particularly in publishing, where if you're a Jewish writer or a white male writer, you're really just not going to get published in this age because these institutions have been pervasively, those institutions, publishing in particular, have been pervasively re-engineered along DEI principles. Um, and I want to keep the idea of DEI principles in mind, and I'll at least somehow try to circle back to it because but maybe I'll take this opportunity now to put into the chat because after all these years, I've finally learned how to do that. A couple of extremely, extremely important links um, that I think everybody should be looking at regarding um, the impact of DEI since in the last decade on institutions, including publishing, including media, and including academia, all of which we periodically focus on here in these talks. Um, Institutions that have been systematically re-engineered against, in particular, white males, against, in particular, white Jewish males, um, and which have been dominated intentionally by design, re-engineered by women and people of color. We know that in the education space, K through 12, and in particular higher education, the DEI enforcement mechanisms and the DEI uh, fellow to faculty pipelines have been critical in replacing a large number of the faculty with ideological adherents, um, all of whom are monolithically opposed to Israel and monolithically anti-American as well. And we know that the ideological enforcement mechanisms have worked very much to the disadvantage of Jewish students in particular, but also faculty members who have complained about the domination of classrooms and campus environments by anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic kinds of elements. And in this note, I'll try and put one more link into the chat here, and that's actually quite important. That is the report, the fourth and final report by the task force at Columbia University, which investigated anti-Semitism inside and outside the classroom, which reached really quite well, to those of us who watch these issues carefully, there are unsurprising conclusions about harassment of Jewish students and faculty, and politicization of classrooms, and the absolute, and this is 100% absolute, anti-Zionist orientation of certain departments, in particular Middle Eastern studies. Again, unsurprising, um, something replicated across the country in every major institution, at least, and kept in place by DEI mechanisms and apparatchiks tasked with creating and maintaining this and other kinds of monocultures. Um, all of which has contributed, and again, I'm going to try and tie all this together in some way. All this, which has contributed to what one of the authors, Jacob Savage, of these pieces, has called a lost generation, particular white males of non-elite white males who have been deprived of what otherwise would have been careers in media, in publishing, in academia, and in other professions as well, leading to a culture of resentment, a culture of anger, a culture that is prone to extremist kinds of arguments, particularly from the right and also from the left. So that's the that's the segue I was trying to make in trying to figure out where we are at the end of 2025 with respect to BDS, with respect to Israel, with respect to anti-Semitism in America and beyond. That's politics and American politics. And what we've seen in the last 90 days since the assassination of Charlie Kirk of Turning Points USA, who really was murdered, as opposed to who really does seem to have been murdered by one guy who was on the far left and whose paramour is transsexual. What we've seen is just this remarkable kind of crack up, intellectual crack up, a mental crack up, and a social crack up on the part of brought about, engineered. And I think that's an important term because it's engineered. It's paid. Somebody is paying for this on the part of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes. Tucker Carlson, who recently appeared in Qatar, praising Qatar, promising to buy a house there, and telling all who would listen that the American-Israeli relationship is worthless and that the Qatari-American relationship is wonderful and everything. Candace Owens, who is who appears to be a complete and total nutcase, who alleges that there's a conspiracy inside TPUSA that was responsible for the murder of Charlie Kirk, and the Jews were involved, and that Egyptian military planes were over the site or had flown into the Salt Lake City airport, and so on. This fabulous enacting a mental breakdown right in front of our eyes. And Nick Fuentes, a kind of gay little Nazi who hates girls, who hates marriage, who just this bizarre little individual. And I have to decline a WhatsApp call. I'm sorry, from my from a relative. Um, back. I apologize for this. Otherwise, it's just going to keep ringing in my ear. Um, so, this is it's a public crack up, and all sorts of polls that have been taken showing that the American right and younger American right wingers are turning decidedly against Israel, who are hostile, increasingly hostile to Israel, see no value, and who are increasingly anti-Semitic as well. But is this real? And I have to ask, is this real? All polls, in my view, are ops. They're influence ops of some kind. They're telling you what they want you to know. We also don't see a lot of real world political grassroots kinds of implications or impacts of these media figures who are exposing their mental illnesses and processes to the public. And I want to contrast that and bring it to the end with looking at what's happening on the American left, where there is absolutely concrete evidence of the anti-Israel turn in the Democratic Party, in Democratic Party politics, which has now been progressively taken over by Democratic Socialists of America factions, particularly in big cities, culminating in the election of Zohran Mamdani, who still won't condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada, just sort of discourages it. The emergence and reemergence of candidates like Brad Lander and Cori Bush and Gerald Platner, proud, well, maybe not so proud anymore, a bearer of a Nazi death's head tattoo, who espouses communist kind of doctrine about seizing the means of production. Cameron Lasky, who's running on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. All of these bizarre figures who are united by whose campaign messages are all Gaza all the time, all genocide all the time, and all APAC is the root of all evil all the time. And this points to these messages resonate with particular demographics, um, in particular with Muslims, and with a section of Gen X and Gen Z voters, and who have been, particularly those who have been raised up in a system where educational materials sponsored by the Qatar Foundation and created by the Brown University Center for Middle East Studies and disseminated to 8,000 different high schools across the eastern United States have been inculcated in this ideology that America is bad, Israel is especially bad, Jews are super duper whites, and um, and that one has to vote one's conscience and oppose all of these things, and ultimately capitalism and ultimately the United States. Um, but I don't want to I don't want to leave on a an especially negative note, but I do want to point to other kinds of trends and that are maybe slightly more hopeful. Um, and again, things move quickly, some things move quickly, some things move slowly. Some things are leading indicators, some things are trailing indicators. We've known for decades that attendance at mainline Christian churches has dropped like a stone, and the drop in attendance at these churches is absolutely indexed to the rise of anti-Israel and increasingly anti-Semitic politics being espoused by these churches. Anglicans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, BDS, leading BDS groups. On the other hand, traditional Catholic Latin masses and Orthodox Jewish and Orthodox Christian conversions are quietly and slowly on the rise. And the answer to loneliness and isolation that has people have been pointing to for 20 years, the whole bowling alone phenomenon, appears to be partially in a section of Gen Z or whatever comes after Gen Z, seems to be resolving itself in the direction of more religious faith and more religious attendance and more religious community. Now, the jury's still out about whether this is going to be a great awakening on the par of the prior great awakenings in American history in the first half of the 19th century, mass scale religious revivals, which reoriented American society decisively towards religion. Too soon to say, but I think there is something happening, and I would be cautiously optimistic that this is good for the Jews, and good for American society and good for the West as well. And So maybe on that hopeful note, I'll stop here and we can take some questions and I'm very curious to hear what other people think.
All right, thank you for that, Alex. There's obviously a lot to unpack, and there's obviously a lot here that we need to discuss. First of all, I'm seeing people did not get your links. Let me try if I can.
Yeah, I can't change that setting from my end. Apologies. I thought I had this whole Zoom thing figured out after all these years, but
I
not
will.
quite.
We will.
We're on it.
We will take care of the links that Alex mentioned, and thank you all for mentioning that. Um, let me start with the first question, to start us off. And I think that you mentioned obviously all the bad news, the good news. Uh, the one thing that, is obviously worthy of note and maybe unpacking a little bit as far as the Islamist stuff, there is obviously on the back end of all of this is the conversation that has started also about designating some of these organizations as FTOs, starting with what happened with, CARE in Texas and now in Florida. There's now conversations as far as potential other designations. Now with the rise, and as we've seen over the past few days, are you seeing or can we expect to see more? Are we understanding that, maybe there's a more of an internalizing as far as the actual threat and where they're coming from vis-a-vis the designations? Obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth, and this, I believe, came out of Ted Cruz's office as far as watering down the language. But why don't we talk a little bit about some of the policy stuff that has come out as a result of the environment that we're seeing? And of course, that obviously relates directly to the Columbia report that you also mentioned.
Right. Well, designating the Muslim Brotherhood has been something, as a foreign terrorist organization, it's been something that people have been desiring and pushing for 20 or so years. And it didn't happen in the first Trump administration. It, it may happen in some form in this administration. Ted Cruz did complain that committee staffers, Senate committee staffers, had watered down the his legislation, which would have designated the entirety and all of the component organizations of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And other people have pointed to staff members responsible for this watering down who, had who recently came back from all expense paid trips to Doha, which is, along with Turkey, the center of the Muslim Brotherhood organization in America, in globally, rather. CARE has threatened to sue the state of Florida, and the governor, Ron DeSantis, has said quite publicly, bring it on, because a lawsuit would expose them to discovery, which would be very interesting, particularly regarding their finances, which have been a question mark, a focal point for many years. The larger issue is, and when we've talked about this in an earlier webinar a couple of weeks ago, is understanding the pervasiveness of the Muslim Brotherhood and its organizations globally and also in America. And it's not the sort of thing exactly where they have um, you know meetings, weekly meetings with minutes to advance the global conspiracy. Although they did in one occasion in 1993 in Philadelphia, and the FBI seized those, or was listening in on that, and then didn't proceed. But all of these organizations, CARE, the Muslim Student Organization, the North American Islamic Trust, and all these things. They work in harmony with one another, with interlocking boards, with mysterious sources of income to promote the narrative of primarily Sunni Islam in America, to demonize Israel and Jews, to promote the idea that Muslims are the key victims of Israel and the West, and so on and so on, designating these organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. It's not clear to me, at least, how that would work in terms of enforcement. Whether, the FBI or Homeland Security would serve warrants and scoop up their computers and arrest their leadership or not. Um, but as with all these things, public awareness about the problems is the first issue. And there is I think, a very much higher level of public awareness regarding the threat of Muslim Brotherhood organizations and other conspiracies that originate within the American and global Islamic communities, um, than ever before. The whole revelation that, a large number of Somali migrants were responsible for over $1 billion worth of fraud in the state of Minnesota alone has been a kind of revelation, I think, for many people, and the pervasive, and its connection with the refugee resettlement industry, which has been financed by the federal government through various organizations like Catholic Charities and, the Lutheran refugee organization and HIAS, whatever they're called. And just the level of interlocking corruption that's intrinsic to this, and also the basic basic threat. I mean, it was a year ago on New Year's Eve, I think, that a specific ISIS attack was carried out in New Orleans, killing a bunch of people. And ISIS groups are being scooped up all over the place in North America and particularly in Europe these days. So there are real threats, and I think in the near term, more awareness is necessary, and execution. Once these groups are listed as foreign terrorist organizations, execution of legal sanctions or measures against them will be critical. And I don't know what's going to happen there. I'm not seeing a lot of talk about that.
Right. And let's not forget the connectivity, per your point, that the connection between Palestinian youth movement and
Right.
DSA, and so the connection to local politics as far as also who were responsible for funding some of the encampments on campus, and all the connection, the conflation of what you and I have discussed and written about over the years as far as the red, green, and brown alliance all coming together.
Very much so.
And so we have that internalization, for lack of a better term here, of Muslim Brotherhood politics within local politics, which are, of course, creating an entire architecture to allow this to happen. And let's also remind everybody who's listening now is, of course, that the current debate about designation, as it started by the Trump administration, is also starting only with the foreign, has not really gotten into domestic stuff, though it should go there. And that's obviously the hope. And the bigger issue, which you mentioned, and something that we've recommended in our recommendations for higher ed, as far as background checks the admissions process into schools, as far as associations and affiliations with FTOs.
Right. And on that front, it's worth mentioning that this week, the administration expanded its essentially no entry rule to include Syria, the Palestinian Authority, and a couple of other places. I think there's a total of 39 countries or entities that are now prohibit where people are prohibited from entering the United States. And there's, of course, a predictable cry, not least of all from the higher education industrial complex, because they want these bodies to fill the seats at colleges and universities. Overall, admissions, or the number of foreign students, is down about 15% over last year. And there were a couple of hundred visa denials and removals. But on the other hand, federal judges keep releasing some of the worst actors, the woman at Tufts and the guy from Columbia,
Okay.
uh, uh, and the implication being that anybody can come here and call for, death to the Jews, death to Israel, death to the United States, and that this is somehow protected under the First Amendment. I find this legally quite puzzling, but I'm not I'm not a lawyer per
So
se.
that's a good segue to our question in the audience by Ross Shorenstein, asking about here the question about that there were a few cases, she's spotlighting, our former guest Rona Kaufman, who looked at a judge that a judge recently believed that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and so that's a growing debate and really a growing challenge that we've seen within the judiciary and within the court system, as far as proving indeed that anti-Zionism is indeed anti-Semitism. Obviously, neither of us are lawyers, but obviously we can comment on some of the strategies as far as making the case. Part of that, I mean, and obviously, I want to hear your perspective. I mean, has been the attempt to try to grow states for adopting the IRA definition. I mean, that has been helpful in some cases, but not in all cases. And obviously, this is a growing problem.
Well, the federal judiciary, um, I'm again, I'm not a lawyer, but the the lower courts have almost uniformly ruled against the Trump administration in every single respect on visa enforcement, on border enforcement, on all sorts of other all sorts of other issues, free speech issues, removal of migrants issues, absolutely in lockstep with the Democratic Party. And then these things are almost uniformly overturned by higher courts, by appellate courts, and some issues have reached the Supreme Court. And then you have, in a few cases, the bizarre spectacle of lower courts over overturning or ignoring the Supreme Court. So there's a judiciary problem in this country, and it's not restricted to our issues. I think it's a reflection of how the lower courts were re-engineered during the Obama and Biden years. Um, and I'll put this in the most generous way possible, stocked with individuals who take the most expansive possible interpretation of rights and citizenship and the most negative view of executive authority, and who regard themselves very much in what you might call the European and Israeli style, particularly Israeli style, as being not only a kind of superior force to the executive branch. Um, and there's just lots and lots of these cases, and the universities themselves, in the cases of defending individuals who've been removed have pretty much latched on to the highest profile cases, free speech cases. And that's, the so-called free speech advocates like Fire and so-called have looked at these. They haven't made so much universities and other advocacy groups outside of the Democratic Party and local politicians aren't usually defending the hundreds of foreign students who are convicted of DUIs and who've been involved in breaking and entering and armed robbery and so on, who've been removed. But on the other hand, there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for supporting um, illegal migrants who murder people on subways and rapists and things like that. I think the reality is that the judiciary is part of the political process and has been highly politicized, um, thanks to the way appointments have been done in the last 25 years, and also legal education, which is elite legal education is, dominated by critical legal studies and strongly anti-authoritarian, meaning judicial authority is good and everybody else's authority is bad, and the root problem being America and its cis normative kinds of white supremacist legal tradition, so called. And our issues are casualties, you might say, of these kinds of trends, which are longer term trends, which have now come into focus literally in the last 11 months since the Trump administration has been in office.
So thank you for that. Let me just jump to another, aspect that, we, obviously as we're trying to sum up, the past year, and obviously we're drinking, it's like from a fire hose.
It's too early.
Too
I
early.
assure everyone it's too early to
It's
spill the
early to
tea.
sum it all up yet. We're not yet, toasting anything. But just to kind of look as far as the trajectory of things. One of the things, obviously, that you and I have discussed, and obviously I think is on people's minds as well, the current correlation and the connectivity between the current reality as it relates to the war in Gaza, while obviously we're still waiting on one last deceased hostage, dead, murdered hostage, to be brought back. And the correlation of, which you and I have been discussing, for over 2 years now, as far as the impact of the war in Gaza to the war on the American college campus. Despite the fact that the hostages have been brought back, we are seeing, which obviously is a troubling trend, the growth of the denialism vis-a-vis what happened on 10/7, the denial of the rape, the denial of the atrocities and whatnot. I mean, is there something we can point to as we're looking at this kind of collage of the different schools that we all look at as far as some positivity that we're seeing, or is it all the binary perspective has clearly been adopted hook, line, and sinker because of the cacophony of voices from the left, the Islamists, the Nazis, as they play out on the campuses.
Um, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the encamp, we'll back up for half a step. Encampments are very much down this year. Campus protests are very much down this year. Classroom invasions are very much down this year. And one of the reasons for that is that lots of rules about time, place, and manner for protests have been enacted, and universities and colleges have literally been locking down their campuses. Although in the case of Brown University, apparently Apparently not, where somebody can just waltz into a classroom, shout something, we still don't know what, in a strange language it sounds like, and then shoot two people and walk out. And, the Keystone cops who are responsible still won't, haven't interviewed the people in the classroom. That's a kind of sad parenthetical observation. Um, the question is always measurement. We can sort of measure the number of protests and things like that. And I think it's kind of down. But on the other hand, as you say, denialism is widespread, particularly from um, Palestinian and Muslim groups on campus, particularly from certain kinds of far left groups on and off campus, which are all connected in various networks. And the impact of all this on students has, I think, yet to be registered. Uh, I think there's good reason to be concerned, and certainly good reason to be disgusted and revolted. I mean, and again, to back up another three-quarters of a step, the response from the organized feminist movements and groups towards the perfectly well documented incidents of rape and sexual assault of males and females, and as well as kidnapping and murder and torture has been appalling, has been disgusting. Um, and I would attribute this not so much to these groups having been bought off, but rather by or even cognitive dissonance of some kind, where they simply can't accept it. I think they don't care. I think they don't care to the point where it's convenient to deny it, and that their people and groups are so suffused with this oppressor oppressed binary. It's as an article of religious belief. They simply can't believe that Palestinians who've been elevated to this exalted position as the sacralized people replacing the Jews as the ultimate victims, and who have no free will, who can only react, and yet who are, dignified in their 100 years of resistance. And in any case, what can you expect from people who are occupied? All these kinds of stories and rationalizations. And if a few Jews get murdered and tortured, then it's it it's too bad, or it didn't happen. Well, there's a progression. It's like, oh, it's bad. It didn't happen. If it happened, it's good. Yeah, it's really good. Something
Right.
something like that. And I think the process of it's not simply rationalization, it's legitimization that's gone on. And to my mind, it goes back to the a philosophical and epistemological question of whether you can have a decent left-wing viewpoint um, that's based in equality, um, equality with big air quotes, and I don't think you can. That's just my opinion. Again, I can't speak for, I won't speak for SPME under these circumstances, obviously, but I think that philosophically and cognitively one can't, because in order to equalize all peoples and narratives and cultures and events, one has to downplay, downgrade, eliminate, justify, elide, rationalize, celebrate certain acts of post-colonial murder and mass slaughter and torture and rape as a way of creating equity in the world. What other tools do these poor people have? Israel has F-15s, and all the Palestinians have are their souls in their hands and the ability to rape and murder and torture and kidnap.
Don't
Um,
forget about throwing rocks at stones at tanks. I mean,
right.
that's the old David and Goliath metaphor, and the sacralization that you're talking about is this is the this is the religious anchor that has always been, and the root cause of the historical revisionism that has basically taken place here. That has anchored itself in higher education and beyond. I mean, it goes down, as we all know, to K through 12, as far as sanitizing this reality where there is, again, how much does one need to self-flagellate, to be a rank and file member of the left, to your point,
Right. And to say this, one doesn't um, legitimize or encourage the opposite kinds of viewpoint. A a right-wing viewpoint, although I don't know what that term means anymore. It, and as we follow the horseshoe theory of where where the opposites actually meet on the dark side of the moon now, Tucker Carlson and Ben Rhodes, who was recently in the pages of the Atlantic magazine saying that Israel should be cut off completely. There should be no American relationship essentially between with Israel. That's Tucker Carlson. You know, Ben Rhodes is doing it because he wants the Democrats to win, and he thinks that that can be the key organizing feature of the Democratic Party. Carlson, who's not exactly affiliated with any parties at this point, essentially is saying the same thing from the right. So one doesn't have to adopt a right-wing viewpoint, whatever that is, which is, equally revolting in its own unique way, but not all that different necessarily from the left-wing view. And maybe this is a good place to end, is with the end of the year call for the return not only to sanity but to centrist kinds of politics that are empirically based, that calls a spade, that calls murder and rape murder
murder and rape.
and rape, and which is appropriately condemns Israel when it does terrible and stupid things, as it sometimes does, but also realizes that that has nothing to do, and it justifies in no way whatsoever murdering Jews on the other side of the planet or murdering Jews anywhere. So, and unless we can leave these churches that that we have constructed for ourselves and disenthrall ourselves from these not simply the passions, but the religious beliefs, then we're in a big heap of trouble, and things will not get better.
But that's a
Th-
good
That's a good place to
that's a good positive note to end on, as far as, returning back to sanity, returning back to to normalcy, finding the center if we could try to find it, which is, historically been, centrist politics have been American politics, but we know it's harder to come by, exactly because of your point vis-a-vis the horseshoe imagery, which is also true. But that I think, that should be our aspirational goal for the new year.
I think so.
And I
I
think
think
that
so.
that, positively, we have seen some universities in the South who have been a little bit more tolerant to these issues, and are experiencing and understanding what the realities are. And let's not forget, the hatred is not only anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, it's also anti-American and anti-Western. So let's, be
Right.
very clear about what the threats are.
The question is never the question, and all of us are being targeted. And it's just, the Jews get it first, but uh, you know, we have to be honest about, Christian persecution in Africa and elsewhere as on the basis of body counts alone being incredibly profound and terrible problems that have to be addressed. Until we can widen our focus away from the Jews and look at the world as it is, at least more parts of the world, then but let's hope that we can all widen our view and open our heads and so on.
That's a good thing. Well, Alex, as always, I want to thank you for taking the time. Above all, I want to thank our audience, as always, for joining us this afternoon. As I mentioned before, let me take the opportunity to wish everybody a happy holiday season, a happy new year, a better year for everybody.
And to stay safe and to keep your heads on a swivel. There are bad things that are happening, and have to keep your eyes open.
Being vigilant is always a good thing, and we need to keep on doing that. Be on the lookout, as always, for future webinars. We will return back to our regular scheduled shows right after the new year. Again, I want to thank everybody for their ongoing support of our work. This is the end of the year, so I encourage you to continue investing in our work here at SPME. There's a lot that needs to be done, and we are greatly appreciative of all of that, as always. And again, have a stay safe, have a happy holiday season, and a happy new year, and we will talk soon.
Thanks. Be well.